right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating today. We're heading down to Brazil, specifically their online betting scene. They're completely transforming how this whole thing works. And we've got a stack of legal documents, actual laws, both in Portuguese and English, to help us decode this regulatory overhaul and what it means for, well, the players.
Yeah, it's quite a shift. You're right, Brazil's betting scene was a bit of a Wild West, but now it's getting a major makeover. New rules, new tech, the whole landscape is changing.
I'm already hooked, but for those who might not be as familiar, what's the biggest change for someone who's, used to placing bets online in Brazil?
Transparency, without a doubt. I mean, up until now, it's been a bit of a free-for-all, right?
Yeah.
But with fixed odds betting, well, everything's laid out up front. You know the odds, you know the rules, you know exactly how much you stand to win or lose. No more shady dealings, no more hidden surprises.
Sounds like a major win for the players then, at least when it comes to fairness. But Brazil isn't stopping at just setting the odds, are they? They're also going all in on consumer protection, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they've directly linked better rights to Brazil's existing consumer protection code. So it's not just about regulating the industry itself, it's about making it part of a larger system of consumer rights.
Okay, so this isn't like some separate set of rules then. It's all tied into a system that's already in place, which is a pretty smart move, if you ask me.
Exactly. It creates consistency and leverages existing legal mechanisms.
And it shows that Brazil is serious about protecting bettors.
Yeah, we're talking clear information about the rules, the odds, the risks involved. Even data privacy is covered under the General Data Protection Law.
And data privacy. Well, that brings us to something that I think a lot of people are going to have questions about. Facial recognition. Article 23 says operators have to use this technology to verify the identity of bettors. Isn't that a little, intrusive? Like, I get wanting to prevent underage gambling, but is facial recognition really necessary to achieve that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is this overkill, or is it a necessary step to ensure responsible betting? It's a debate that's happening all over the world, and Brazil's jumped right in.
It's definitely uncharted territory, no doubt. But let's talk about the other side of the coin, the operators themselves. What happens if they don't follow the rules? Are we talking a slap on the wrist or something more serious?
Let's just say Brazil means business. Chapter X of the law has a whole range of penalties. Warnings, fines, suspension, even revoking operating licenses. And the fines, they can go up to 2 billion Brazilian reais.
2 billion? That's not that's a financial nuke.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
Okay, so Brazil's building this fortress of regulations. But then there's this one area where they're taking a different approach. Fantasy sports. Article 49 specifically says they're exempt from these rules.
Yeah.
I mean, it almost feels like a loophole.
It's an interesting exception, for sure, and it reflects a broader global debate. Brazil's argument is that fantasy sports depend more on knowledge and strategy. It's skill over chance, they say.
But even in fantasy sports, there's always an element of luck involved, right? I mean, a player could get injured out of nowhere and completely mess up your strategy.
That's true. It's a bit of a gray area.
So what's Brazil's end game here?
Well, I think they're hoping that by giving fantasy sports more space to breathe, they'll encourage innovation and growth in that sector.
So it's a gamble in itself, a bet on the potential of a less regulated fantasy sports industry.
It is, and it'll be fascinating to see how it all unfolds.
I think what we're seeing here is that Brazil is forcing us to really think differently about the whole world of betting. It's not just about placing bets anymore. It's about understanding the rules, the technology, the implications for players like us.
You got it. And speaking of technology, let's talk about one of the most detailed parts of this whole thing. The technical specifications laid out in Ordinance No. for 722.
Okay, I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty. What kind of tech hurdles do operators have to overcome to meet these standards?
Everything. We're talking time synchronization, monitoring of system components, detailed logging of bettor activity. It's incredibly detailed and thorough.
So they're basically trying to make online betting as secure as online banking.
You could say that. They're requiring a level of security and transparency that's pretty unprecedented in this industry.
One of the things that really stands out is that operators have to authenticate all the essential parts of their control program every single day. It's like a daily digital fingerprint to make sure nobody's tampered with the system. Is that reassuring to you, or does it feel like overkill?
I think it's both, to be honest. It's reassuring to know they're taking security seriously, but it also raises questions about privacy and surveillance.
It's a trade-off, that's for sure.
It is, and it's one that we need to think carefully about.
It's not just about preventing hacking either. They're also demanding systems that can monitor everything. network traffic, player activity.
Right. It's like having a digital watchdog constantly on the lookout for any potential issues.
Okay, so we've got the legal framework, consumer protection, facial recognition, penalties, the exemption for fantasy sports. We've even gotten into the technical details. But what about the money itself? Where does all the revenue from these bets actually go?
That's where things get really interesting. Ordinance No. 12,212 lays out how the money from fixed odds betting is distributed, and it's not just going into government coffers.
Oh, okay, I'm all ears. Who gets a piece of the pie?
Well, the ordinance lists specific percentages for different beneficiaries. Social Security is a big one, but there's also money for health, sports, tourism.
So they're trying to use this revenue to benefit society as a whole.
Exactly. It's about spreading the wealth, so to speak.
I like the sound of that. But how do we know the money actually gets where it's supposed to go? Is this a game changer for these areas, or is it just a drop in the bucket?
That's a question worth exploring, definitely.
Okay, so we've got all this money coming in, but with great revenue comes great responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about advertising. I'm guessing Brazil isn't just letting operators go wild with promises of easy money.
You're right, they're not. Ordinance No. 12,231 sets the rules for advertising fixed odds betting. The key words here are transparency and responsibility.
So no more misleading ads or targeting vulnerable groups.
Nope, those days are over.
Good riddance.
The ordinance specifically bans deceptive advertising, and it requires operators to include clear warnings about the risks of gambling. There are even rules for affiliate marketing, so everyone involved is responsible for keeping things ethical.
So it's a shared responsibility then. Everyone in the industry has a role to play.
That's the idea.
But how do they actually make sure operators are doing things the right way? How do they know they're verifying the age and identity of bettors? We talked about facial recognition, but it sounds like there's even more to it than that.
Oh yeah, there's a whole other layer. We're talking about Know Your Better, or KYB. Ordinance No. 1143 has some pretty detailed procedures that operators need to follow. They have to identify, qualify, and classify bettors based on their risk profile.
Okay, now that sounds intense. Fill me in. What are they looking at?
It goes way beyond just checking someone's ID. They're analyzing betting patterns, looking for unusual activity. They're checking for potential involvement of intermediaries, even connections to politically exposed persons.
Politically exposed persons. Wow, that's taken it to a whole other level.
It is, and it shows how seriously they're taking the potential for money laundering and financial crimes. KYB is pretty common in industries where there's a high risk of financial misconduct.
So it's like they're bringing the same level of scrutiny to online betting.
Exactly, and it's a big change for this industry.
It definitely sounds like it. So it's not just about signing up and placing a bet anymore. It's about understanding how you, as a bettor, are being assessed and categorized.
You got it.
Okay, that's something I bet a lot of people aren't aware of.
Probably not.
So we've talked about the rules for bettors, but what about the rules for actually running a betting platform in Brazil? I'm guessing it's not as easy as just setting up a website and taking bets.
It's definitely not a walk in the park. You could compare it to getting approval to open a bank. There are some serious hurdles to clear before you get a license.
Okay, so lay it on me. What do operators have to do to get the green light?
Well, ordinances, no. 827 and no. 28 spell it all out. Think of it like applying to an Ivy League university. You need to prove you're financially stable, that you have the technical expertise, you need to show you have experience in the industry, and that you're committed to responsible gambling.
So they're really raising the bar here. It sounds like they're prioritizing quality over quantity.
Exactly. They want to market with reputable, trustworthy operators.
But doesn't that make it harder for new companies to get started? Wouldn't that stifle competition?
It's a valid point, and it's a trade-off they've made. They're essentially saying, we'd rather have a smaller number of solid, reliable operators than a wild west of unregulated companies.
It's a gamble, isn't it? A bet that a more controlled market will ultimately benefit everyone.
It is, and only time will tell if it pays off.
This has been eye-opening, for sure.
It's a lot to take in.
But it's clear that Brazil is serious about transforming their online betting industry.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not just tweaking the system, they're rebuilding it from the ground up.
And they're doing it with a focus on transparency, security, and consumer protection.
It's a bold move. It'll be fascinating to see how it all unfolds.
Agreed.
Now, let's take a closer look at one of the most intricate aspects of this whole overhaul: the technical specifications for these platforms.
All right, let's get technical. So let's grab our virtual magnifying glass and zoom in on Ordinance number 722. This is where they lay out all the technical requirements for these betting systems. And the first thing that really jumps out at me is the emphasis on security.
Makes sense, right? We're talking real money here. Sensitive data. I'd want to know my information is safe and sound. So how are they making sure these platforms are Fort Knox level secure?
It's like a fortress, really. Multiple layers of protection. The ordinance mandates everything. Data encryption, access controls, system monitoring. It's not just one thing. It's a whole network of safeguards working together.
Okay, I'm liking the sound of that. But can you give me an example, like something specific that really shows how serious they are about this?
One of the key requirements is that operators have to have a system that can authenticate all the critical parts of their control program.
Okay, remind me again, what's the control program?
Oh, right, sorry. It's basically the brains of the whole operation, the software that controls everything, the odds, the payouts, making sure everything runs fairly and accurately.
Got it. So authenticating the control program is like what? Making sure nobody's messed with the code, making sure it's still the original untampered version?
Exactly. And they have to do this authentication at least once every 24 hours. Plus, on demand whenever they need to. So if someone tried to sneak in and change the code to rig the odds or something, this kind of constant authentication makes that virtually impossible.
That's pretty impressive. But doesn't that require a lot of resources from the operators? Are they constantly running checks in the background?
They are, and that's the trade-off, right? More security comes at a price. But when you consider the risks, financial fraud, rigged games, data breaches, that price seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Especially as I definitely feel better knowing a platform is taking security that seriously.
And it's not just about preventing people from intentionally manipulating the system. It's also about making the system more resilient. So it can handle technical glitches, vulnerabilities. Think of it like a backup generator. Even if something unexpected happens, the system stays up and running, and your money is safe.
Okay, now that does make me feel better. But it sounds like they're not just relying on computers to do all the work, right? They're also requiring human oversight.
Oh, absolutely. Ordinance new. 722 also says they have to have systems for human monitoring, real people keeping an eye on everything. Network traffic, user activity, system logs, all of it.
So it's like having security guards patrolling the platform, looking for anything suspicious.
Pretty much.
But how do they know what to look for? Like, what are the red flags that would trigger an investigation?
They're trained to look for patterns that deviate from the norm. For example, let's say a bunch of bets suddenly come in from the same IP address. That could be a sign that someone is trying to manipulate the odds. Or if a player suddenly starts betting way more than usual or in a completely different way. That could be a sign of problem gambling or even money laundering.
So it's not just about catching the obvious cheaters. It's about understanding human behavior and being able to spot those subtle signs that something might be wrong.
Exactly.
It's like they're training digital detectives.
That's a great way to put it.
It's not just about the tech. It's about the people using the tech, their expertise, their ability to analyze data and make decisions.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about security, monitoring, authentication. They're really covering all the bases. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about something that's been pretty controversial, facial recognition technology.
Ah, yes, that's a big one. As we mentioned before, Article 23 of Law, 18790-23, requires operators to use facial recognition. They have to use it to verify the identity of bettors.
And I'm still a little unsure about this. I mean, I get why they want to prevent underage gambling. But is facial recognition really the only way to do that?
It's a valid concern, and that's why this particular rule has generated so much discussion. Facial recognition is powerful, no doubt, but it also raises some serious questions about privacy. Where do we draw the line between security and personal freedom? Is this a trade-off we're willing to make?
It's a tough one. I think the answer depends on who you ask. Some people might be okay with it if it means a safer betting environment, but others might see it as an invasion of privacy.
Right, it's a balancing act.
So what are they doing to protect people's privacy? I mean, we're giving these platforms our biometric data. How do we know it won't be misused?
Well, the regulations are very clear about that. They say this data has to be handled securely and responsibly. They can't just store it anywhere. It needs the same level of security as other sensitive financial information.
So, encryption, secure servers, all that good stuff.
Exactly.
But what about transparency? Do bettors have any say in how their facial recognition data is used?
They do. Operators have to be upfront about how they're using the technology.
Bettors need to know how their data is being collected, used, and stored, and they need to be able to opt out if they're not comfortable with it.
It's all about informed consent.
Okay, that seems fair. But it's still a little creepy, isn't it? I mean, it's our faces we're talking about.
It is, and I think this debate is going to continue as facial recognition becomes more common.
Sure.
It's a good reminder that technology is powerful, but we need to use it responsibly.
Okay, so we've talked about facial recognition, security, monitoring. These platforms are complicated. There are a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts.
But they all have to work together seamlessly.
To create a smooth and secure experience for the better.
Right.
And that brings us to another really important part of this whole technical puzzle, payment processing.
Ah, yes, the money trail.
When you're dealing with real money, you want to know those transactions are safe.
Absolutely. I'm always a little nervous about entering my credit card info online, especially on a new platform. So what's Brazil doing to make sure payments are handled the right way?
Ordinance Now 615 covers all of that. Again, the focus is on security, transparency, and protecting the consumer.
So no more shady payment processors, no hidden fees.
Nope, not anymore.
What about things like deposit limits and fraud prevention?
Those are covered too. Operators have to give bettors tools to set limits on their deposits. And they need to have systems to prevent fraudulent transactions.
Okay, so it's not just about making it easy to pay.
It's about making sure those payments are safe and responsible.
But what happens if someone does go overboard? Like if they get carried away and bet more than they can afford?
That's where responsible gambling comes in. Operators also have to provide resources and support for people who might be struggling with problem gambling.
Okay, so they're not just taking the money and running.
Nope, they have a duty to help people who might need it.
It's all about creating a culture of responsible gambling.
Yeah.
Where operators are actively involved in promoting healthy habits.
Exactly.
That's a really positive step, I think.
It shows they're thinking about the well-being of the people who use these platforms.
It's about finding that balance between profit and social responsibility.
Exactly.
This has been quite a deep dive into the technical side of things.
It has.
My head is spinning a little.
I don't blame you.
But it's amazing to see how much thought and planning has gone into all of this.
It really is impressive.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and we're slowly putting all the pieces together.
And like any good puzzle, there are always a few pieces that make you stop and think.
Exactly. And for me, one of those pieces is the exemption for fantasy sports.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one.
It's not just a small detail. It's a fundamental question about what gambling even means, especially in a world where the lines between skill and chance are getting blurrier all the time.
That's right, and it's a question that countries all over the world are grappling with.
It's not just a legal definition either. It's about how we, as individuals, see these games. Are they entertainment, a test of skill, or a gateway to addiction?
It's a complicated issue, and one that we need to talk about more.
For sure. But for now, let's focus on what this exemption means for Brazil. So, fantasy sports platforms are exempt from the rules for fixed odds betting. But does that mean they can operate with no oversight at all?
Not quite. They're still subject to general consumer protection laws and any other relevant regulations.
So it's not a complete free-for-all?
No, there are still rules in place.
But the level of oversight is definitely lighter?
That's true.
So what's Brazil's thinking here?
Well, I think they're hoping that this will create a more dynamic and innovative fantasy sports sector. They're betting that the market will kind of self-regulate and that the focus on skill will lead to more responsible gaming.
It's a risk, for sure.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. Will this lead to a boom in fantasy sports? Or will it create a whole new set of problems?
Only time will tell.
But one thing's for sure. Brazil is making a bold move, and everyone's watching to see what happens.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. We've really gone deep into Brazil's online betting scene, all the rules, the tech behind it, the money, even the ethical stuff. But now I kind of want to zoom out a little. Look at the bigger picture, What does all this mean for Brazil as a whole? Is this just about betting? Or is there something more going on here?
It's way bigger than just betting. They're reshaping a whole industry, and that has consequences, Think of it like this. Brazil's sending a message, not just to people who bet or the companies running these platforms, but to the world. They're saying, we're modernizing, we're open for business, but we're doing it our way. Responsibly, transparently, all that.
I see what you mean. That's a strong message. But let's get down to brass tacks. What could this mean for Brazil's economy specifically? Are we talking new jobs, more investment? Or is it too soon to tell?
It's still early, yeah. But the potential is definitely there. When you have a well-regulated market, it attracts legitimate companies. That creates jobs, not just in betting, but in all the related areas too. Tech, marketing, customer service.
So it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
And then there's the tax revenue. All those allocations to Social Security, healthcare, sports.
That's money that can be reinvested, potentially fund important programs.
That all sounds great in theory, but how do we actually measure the impact? Is this money really making a difference in people's lives?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that researchers and policymakers are going to be looking at closely. It's not just about how much money they bring in. It's about how that money is used. Does it actually reach the people who need it?
So we got to keep our eyes open, not just on the betting itself, but on how this revenue is being used.
Absolutely. Follow the money, see if it's making a real difference.
Okay, so we've got potential benefits, both economic and social. But are there any risks? Any potential downsides to opening up this market?
There are always risks. One of the big ones is problem gambling. Even with all the responsible gambling stuff they're putting in place, some people are still going to struggle with addiction.
That's a serious problem, not just for the individual, but for their families, their communities.
For sure. And Brazil needs to be ready for that. It's not enough to just have tools on these platforms. They need a whole support system. Education, prevention, treatment.
It's a complex problem that needs a complex solution.
Okay.
So we've got the economic upsides, the social challenges, the potential risks. It's a lot to consider. Overall, do you think Brazil's on the right track with all of this?
I think so, yeah. They're putting a lot of thought into this. They're being careful. They're not just opening the floodgates and hoping for the best. They're really trying to find that balance between economic growth and social responsibility.
It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, it is.
But it seems like they're committed to getting it right.
Yeah, and they're doing it in a way that's transparent, accountable. They're not avoiding the tough conversations, like facial recognition, the problem of gambling addiction. They're talking to people, listening to feedback, constantly adjusting your approach.
It's a process.
It is, and that's what makes it so interesting to watch.
This isn't just about rules and regulations. It's about a country figuring out how to handle a rapidly changing industry, trying to build something that's responsible and sustainable for the future.
Well said.
This has been quite the deep dive.
It really has.
We've covered so much ground.
A lot of ground.
But I think it's important to remember that this is just the start of the conversation.
It is.
Brazil's online betting scene is just getting started. It's going to be fascinating to see how it all unfolds.
Absolutely.
So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking questions, and whatever you do, bet responsibly. Until next time,